Hello, I'm Tony, and I'm here to talk about how to build an app. I realised in putting this presentation together that there's a lot to building an app, and it's going to be very difficult to get it all in 10 minutes. So what I'm going to attempt to do is spend the first half of the presentation going through some core concepts as to what's involved, and the second half, I presume that some people in this room might have an idea for an app or something that they want to build. So I'm going to go through the process of brainstorming, wireframing, and finding someone to actually build the app for you. So first of all, a little bit about me. As Aoife mentioned, I'm currently working at the Summit, which apparently I just found out has bought everyone drinks tonight. So drink away. I've been there for 2 years. When I started, it was 10 staff. It's grown to about 50 staff, and we've got a dev team now of 7 or 8 people. Before that, I co-founded a startup called Butter.ie, which was in the NDRC, which is another startup incubator in Dublin. And before that, I built freelance websites for small and medium-sized businesses. So I have about 8, 9 years experience in building and designing for the web. So I mentioned that I was going to go into some core concepts as to what a web app is and how it works. So apologies to anyone who is in any way technologically literate in the room, because I've grossly oversimplified most of this stuff just to get the message across. So the three parts that I'm going to look at are the front end, the database, and then a dynamic language, which brings the front end, connects the front end to the database essentially. So the front end is the part of your app that the public sees. It's every single web page on the internet is built out of HTML and CSS. They're the two most basic fundamental languages. So every page you go onto, whether it's Facebook, Google, Twitter, they're all built in HTML and CSS. HTML defines your structure and your content, and CSS is for your layout and your design. JavaScript is a third language. It's very prominent in front end, but it's more complicated, and for the purposes of this demonstration, all you need to know is that it exists, because I could spend another few hours going into that. So just a quick demonstration of this. I think the contrast on this doesn't look great, but basically this is what a page looks like when you just use HTML. So I used the 100 Minds page as an example. So you basically have text content and a small bit of structure, but there's no design or layout. If I add in CSS, then I get the background colors, the font sizes, the border radiuses, all that sort of stuff. So that's really, really brief synopsis of what HTML is, what CSS is, and how they kind of come together. And as I said, they make up what's called the front end of an application. So that brings me on to the database. So how many people in the room have used a spreadsheet software such as Microsoft Excel or any open office or any of those kind of things? So most people are actually quite familiar with the database and what it is. A database in the context of a web application is essentially just a big spreadsheet. It's similar in that there's rows and columns of data. You can add, modify, remove, search, filter, order, run computations. One of the biggest things that differs between a spreadsheet and a database in the context of a web application is that most of the time when you deal with the database, you're writing code to deal with it. So you don't have this lovely visual editor that you have in Excel where you can see everything and search and filter that way. So you have to write code to deal with the data. Another thing is that so I've got an example. Again, the contrast isn't great here, but this is just a quick example of two database tables that we would use for the 100 Minds web app. So on one side, you've got people, and as you can see, you've got these are column headings, or you can imagine them being column headings in an Excel spreadsheet. Same with donations. So you've got set column headings. The nice thing with web applications and the way they run is that you can connect various different object types to each other. So for the purposes of this, we want to say that a donation belongs to a person. So I give it a person ID, and that means that for every donation that goes into the database, it's connected to a person. Again, might go over a lot of people's heads, but it just I think vaguely explains the concept. And that means that I can write a line of code, which is literally 4 words. So this is just an example of a piece of code I would write to get the sum of the amount of donations for a particular person. So that's, I think, vaguely how the database works, like in its broadest sense. In the context of a web application. So far we've gone through the front end and the database, and I think this leaves us in a good position to answer a question that I get asked very regularly, which is what's the difference between a website and a web application? In its simplest terms, a website is essentially just a front end. It's HTML and CSS. There's no database behind it, and there's no dynamic language. So a web application has a front end and a database, and then what connects the front end to the database is what's called the dynamic language, which I'll go into now. Another question that I often get asked is what's the difference between a web designer and a web developer? In short, you can basically, a rule of thumb is that if you build websites, you're a web designer. If you build web apps, you're a web developer. Again, grossly oversimplifying, so apologies to any designer slash developers in the room, of which I'm actually one. So with that brings us on. We've looked briefly at the front end and the database, so it brings us on to a dynamic language. Again, you could spend hours talking about dynamic languages and what they are. I think a good way or a quick way of explaining it is anyone who says they're a programmer or a developer normally means they've got good experience with a dynamic language, or they'd use, I don't know if people have heard of, say, PHP, Ruby, Java, or Python. They'd be the kind of most prominent ones. It's essentially the heart of your application, so anything that you build runs through one of these. You would choose one of these four languages, and it's unlike the HTML or CSS code, it's never actually seen by the user. So you can actually, any page that you go onto, you can view the source, and that will show you all of the HTML and CSS that built it. But dynamic languages live what's called on the server side, so you never actually, the end user can never actually see any of the code that you write. On top of a dynamic language, so if you're building a web app, you can use a dynamic language and talk directly to your database and use it as the connector between the front end and the database. But what most people do is they use a framework. So a framework is a set of code libraries and standards that increase the speed and efficiency of writing a web application. So it's something that then sits on top of your dynamic language. So an example would be with PHP, people would use Laravel. Ruby, people would use Rails. And with Python, people would use Django. So it basically is another layer on top of your dynamic language that just makes building a web app much, much quicker and easier. So these are a few of the concepts. I won't go into them again, but views, models, routing, forms, plugins, things that make it much, much easier to build a web application. So I think I should have put in an extra slide here with the diagram of how it all fits together, but that in brief is the first section, and it kind of gives people hopefully a broad idea of what goes into building a web application and how it works. Hopefully I didn't get too technical, but also didn't keep it too simple. So I think a lot of people in the room, or some people in the room, might be interested in building their own web applications. So just to look at that, like what that would entail. So ideally you would have a designer and a developer. Designers and developers are generally two very separate people. I mean, sometimes you can find people who do both, but most of the time you're going to have to get both a designer and a developer, or an agency who would have both on their staff. So the designer, if you're looking for a designer for a web product or application, you're looking at a UI or UX designer. So there are different types of designers. There's brand and print designers as well. Generally, they tend to be two separate things. So if you're looking for a designer for a web application, look for someone who's built software before or designed software before. Again, with the developer, look for someone who has experience with a dynamic language and a framework. So like that would generally be someone who's built apps on Ruby on Rails or on Django. These are just other people at the bottom here that could fit in sometimes, but generally when you have a designer and a developer on your team, most people will have the skills that the people at the bottom also have. So this is just, I actually found myself in the last few weeks talking to several people who were in the process of trying to build a web app and knowing nothing about how they worked. And they wanted kind of guidance as to what like steps they should take. So I actually just kind of transcribed this from a few emails that I wrote out to people. I think a good first step is to get a pen and paper, come up with the kind of core functions that you want your app to be able to perform, write them down, and then start sketching out screens. You don't need to be a designer to do this. You need to have an idea of what you want to build, and literally just pen and paper, put down the four most important screens, 3 or 4 most important screens. And then you can also use Balsamiq or Envision app or online tools that allow you to do that a little bit clearer. But again, I would really recommend pen and paper because I think it's the quickest way to get something out of your head into something tangible. Phase 2 is design. So find a good UI or UX designer. They can be tricky to find, especially in Dublin, but once you put in a little bit of effort, I'm sure there's actually plenty in this room as well, so have a chat to people at the end. If you Google UI, UX design Dublin, Dribble is another good place to find people, LinkedIn, meetups. You need to find someone who focuses on functionality, not aesthetics, definitely for the initial iteration anyway. You want to be able to get across an idea of what the product is. And then this phase is essentially to turn your sketches that you have done with pen and paper into actual real product designs. Now, you're not going to have anything functioning at this stage, but the idea is that by the end of the second stage, you've converted the idea in your head to something tangible, which you can show to investors, friends, developers, and then you can move the design forward or the product forward. Phase 3 is developed. Now, I've just written down a list of general things here. I can put these online later on. I won't go through them all now. But once you've got the kind of general idea meshed out in your head and design, then you can move on to finding preferably a developer with 2-3 years experience with a dynamic language and a framework such as Ruby on Rails or Django. I think that's all. That's everything that I tried to fit in everything, as I said, that I could. So yeah, that's me.